My world shattered in an instant. I was in the kitchen, standing by the sink, absently washing dishes when my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from Chloe, my best friend. Normally, her texts were lighthearted, funny memes, or something about our weekend plans, but this one was different. The words blurred as my eyes skimmed over the screen, my stomach twisting into a knot that felt like it would rip me apart. I don't know how to tell you this, but I thought you should know. I saw Jake today, with someone else, at a restaurant. He was holding her hand. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, and I could feel the blood drain from my face as the world seemed to tip sideways. My hands trembled so violently that the plate I was holding slipped from my grasp, shattering against the floor. I didn't even flinch at the sound of it breaking. My mind was already elsewhere, racing a mile a minute, struggling to comprehend the weight of those words. Jake, my husband of 7 years, my partner, the man I thought I knew better than anyone, was holding someone else's hand. The absurdity of it echoed in my mind. He couldn't have. He wouldn't. There had to be some mistake. Maybe Chloe saw someone who looked like him? But deep down, I knew Chloe wouldn't say something like this if she wasn't certain. I dropped to my knees beside the broken plate, numb, unable to process anything beyond that single image Chloe had placed in my head. Jake, smiling, holding another woman's hand. Tears stung my eyes, but I wiped them away furiously. Not yet. I couldn't fall apart yet. My phone buzzed again, Chloe's name lighting up the screen once more. I hesitated before opening the message, knowing whatever came next would either confirm my worst fears or offer a glimmer of hope that this was all just a misunderstanding. I'm sorry. I didn't want to believe it either, but I took a photo. I thought you should see it yourself. I hate to do this to you, but you deserve to know. With shaking fingers, I opened the attachment. The image loaded slowly, pixel by pixel, until there it was. Crystal clear.
Jake.
Sitting in a dimly lit corner of a cozy restaurant I didn't recognize, his hand intimately wrapped around a blonde woman's fingers. He was smiling in that soft, affectionate way I hadn't seen in a while. That smile used to be mine. My breath hitched, and a sob escaped before I could stop it. The reality crashed down around me. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't some misunderstanding. The truth was staring me in the face, cold and undeniable. He was with someone else. My husband. My Jake. I stared at the photo for what felt like an eternity, 1,000 questions swirling in my mind. Who was she? How long had this been going on? Did he love her? Did he even love me anymore? My hands balled into fists, nails digging into my palms as I fought to stay composed, but I couldn't. Not anymore. The dam broke, and the tears came fast and hard, racking my body with uncontrollable sobs. It felt like my heart was being ripped from my chest, torn apart piece by piece, until there was nothing left but hollow emptiness. How could he do this to me? How could he betray me like this after everything we'd been through? The late nights spent talking about our future, the years of building a life together, the promises he'd made to always be by my side. I thought we were happy. Sure, things hadn't been perfect lately. What marriage is after so many years. We had our arguments, moments of frustration, but I never imagined this. I pulled myself up from the floor, shaky and weak, barely able to stand as I gripped the counter for support. My mind was racing, torn between wanting to scream at him, confront him, demand answers, and the crushing fear of what those answers might be. Was I not enough? Was there something I did wrong? The self-doubt crept in, clawing at my insides. Maybe I'd been too focused on work lately, or maybe I hadn't been attentive enough, loving enough. Maybe I'd driven him away. But then another thought surfaced, one that brought with it a wave of anger.
No.
This wasn't my fault. I didn't make him cheat. He made that choice, all on his own. He made the decision to lie, to break our vows, to seek comfort in someone else's arms. I picked up my phone and stared at Jake's name in my contacts list. My finger hovered over the call button, my pulse pounding in my ears. What was I supposed to say? How was I supposed to start this conversation? Should I even give him the chance to explain? Before I could decide, I heard the front door creak open, and my heart leapt into my throat. Jake was home. The sound of his footsteps echoed down the hallway, getting closer. I froze, still standing by the sink, my body trembling as a wave of nausea rolled over me. He had no idea that I knew. No idea that my entire world had come crashing down around me just moments ago. When he walked into the kitchen, he smiled at me, that same easy smile he'd always given me when he came home from work. It felt like a punch to the gut. How could he look at me like that? So normal, so calm, when he'd been with someone else just hours ago. How could he pretend like everything was fine? "Hey, babe," he said, leaning in to kiss me on the cheek. I flinched, pulling away before his lips could touch my skin. He frowned, concern flashing in his eyes. "You okay? You look pale." I couldn't speak. The words were stuck in my throat, heavy and suffocating. All I could see was that photo, that woman's hand in his, that smile that wasn't meant for me anymore. "Babe," he said again, more insistent this time. "What's wrong?" I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "Who is she?" Jake blinked, clearly caught off guard. "What?" I clenched my fists, trying to steady my voice. "Don't lie to me, Jake."
Who is
she? His face paled, and for a split second, I saw the guilt flash in his eyes before he quickly masked it with confusion. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I saw you." My voice cracked, the pain seeping through every word. "Chloe saw you. She sent me a photo. You were with another woman, holding her hand." Tears welled up in my eyes, but I blinked them away, refusing to let him see how broken I was. Jake's jaw clenched, and he rubbed a hand over his face. "It's not what you think," he said quietly, but the lie was so thin I could see right through it. "Don't," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Don't make this worse by lying to me. Just tell me the truth. Please." For a long moment he said nothing. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating, until finally he exhaled a long, shaky breath and looked away. "I'm sorry," he muttered. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It got out of control." And with those words, my heart broke all over again. My knees buckled, and I collapsed into the nearest chair. His words, simple as they were, cut deeper than I thought possible. I didn't mean for it to happen? That's all he had to say after 7 years together? After everything we'd shared, every promise he'd made? Jake remained standing, his back to me now, shoulders tense as though he were bracing for something. My reaction, maybe. I stared at him, my mind reeling, trying to process what he had just admitted. "How long?" My voice was barely a whisper, but the weight of the question hung in the air between us. He hesitated, and I could see the conflict on his face.
He didn't want to tell me.
He wanted to shield me from the worst of it, as if withholding the truth could somehow soften the blow. But there was no softening this. There was no going back. 6 months, he finally said, his voice strained. It started 6 months ago. 6 months. Half a year of lies. Half a year of sneaking around, of coming home to me and pretending everything was fine while he was with her. My stomach turned, and I felt like I might be sick. "Who is she?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. My mind conjured all kinds of images, some younger, prettier woman who had somehow managed to steal my husband's affection right from under me. Someone who, in his eyes, was better than me, more exciting, more worthy of his love. Jake shook his head, not looking at me. It doesn't matter.
She's nobody.
It was just a mistake."
A mistake.
He kept using that word like it could explain everything, like it could erase what he had done. I clenched my fists, feeling the hot sting of tears behind my eyes. I didn't want to cry anymore. I didn't want him to see how much this was destroying me. "If she's nobody," I said, my voice hardening, "then why did it last 6 months? Why didn't you stop it the first time?" He flinched, and for a moment, he was silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost ashamed. "I don't know. I wanted to stop. I didn't mean for it to go on like this. But it felt easy. It felt different." He turned around then, meeting my gaze, and I could see the regret in his eyes. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough. "Easy." I repeated, my voice shaking with fury.
Easy?
Is that all it was to you? Something easy to do while I was here, holding everything together? While I was trusting you, loving you, being your wife. He looked stricken, but I couldn't stop. The anger was boiling inside me now, pushing aside the pain, and I let it out, let it consume me. Do you know what this feels like? I demanded, standing up from the chair, my heart pounding in my chest. Do you have any idea how it feels to find out that the person you trusted more than anyone in the world has been lying to you? Betraying you? Every time you kissed me, every time you touched me, you were lying, Jake. He winced as though my words had physically struck him, but I didn't care. He deserved to feel every bit of pain he had inflicted on me. I never meant to hurt you, he said softly, stepping toward me. I swear I never wanted this to happen. I backed away, holding up a hand to stop him from coming any closer. Don't
touch me.
Don't tell me you didn't want this to happen, because if that were true, you wouldn't have done it. You chose this, Jake. You chose her. His shoulders slumped, and he ran a hand through his hair, looking desperate, lost. I know I screwed up. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but he faltered, his voice cracking. I still love you. I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and painful in my own ears. You love me? You don't get to say that anymore. Love isn't just a word you throw around when it's convenient, Jake. If you loved me, you wouldn't have broken us. You wouldn't have destroyed everything we built together. Tears blurred my vision, but I blinked them away, refusing to let him see me break again. I had cried enough. I had given him enough of my pain. Is it over? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Are you still seeing her? Jake hesitated, and in that split second of silence, my heart plummeted all over again. He wasn't sure. He couldn't even give me the decency of a simple answer. I haven't seen her in a few weeks, he said slowly. I ended it, but he trailed off, and I knew what he wasn't saying. He wasn't sure if it was truly over. He wasn't sure if he'd be able to resist going back to her. The room felt too small, too suffocating. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't be near him, not right now. I needed space, distance, something to stop the whirlwind of emotions that threatened to pull me under. I can't do this, I whispered, my voice breaking. I can't be here with you. Not right now. Jake's face crumpled, and he took a step toward me, his hands outstretched, but I backed away again, my entire body recoiling from his presence. Please, just give me a chance to explain. I need you to leave. I cut him off, my voice firm despite the tremble in my chest.
Go.
Just go. For a moment, he looked like he might argue, but then he saw the resolve in my eyes. His shoulders sagged in defeat, and he nodded slowly. Okay, he murmured, his voice hoarse. I'll go. But please, don't shut me out completely. Let me try to make this right. Let me prove to you that I can fix this. But his words felt hollow, empty. How could he possibly fix something that was so thoroughly broken? How could he put back the pieces of my heart that he had shattered? I didn't respond. I couldn't. I turned my back on him, not trusting myself to stay composed if I looked at him any longer. I heard him sigh softly, and then the sound of his footsteps retreating down the hall. A moment later, the front door closed behind him. And then there was silence. I stood there, alone in our kitchen, the weight of everything crashing down on me once more. My chest heaved with silent sobs, and I gripped the edge of the counter, trying to steady myself, trying to keep from falling apart. But I couldn't. I had been holding it together for too long. I sank to the floor, burying my face in my hands as the tears came in waves, each one more painful than the last. The love I thought would last forever was gone, tainted by betrayal and lies. The man I had built my life with, the man I thought I knew better than anyone, was a stranger now. I don't know how long I stayed there, crying on the cold kitchen tiles, but eventually, the tears stopped. The pain didn't. It throbbed in my chest, a constant reminder of what I had lost, but the tears were gone. All that was left was the raw, aching emptiness that threatened to swallow me whole. And I was alone. The next few days passed in a blur. I barely left the house. I couldn't face the world outside, couldn't bear the thought of pretending like everything was normal when my entire life had been turned upside down. Every corner of the house reminded me of Jake, of the life we had shared, of the future we had planned together. I couldn't escape him. Even though he wasn't physically there, his presence lingered in every room, in every photo on the walls, in every piece of furniture we had chosen together. The weight of his absence was suffocating, and yet, at the same time, I was grateful for it. I needed space to breathe, to think, to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. Chloe called me several times, her voice filled with concern every time she left a voicemail, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I couldn't talk about it. Not yet. Talking about it would make it real, and I wasn't ready to face that reality. Jake texted me once, just to ask if I was okay. I ignored it. What was I supposed to say? How could I possibly be okay after everything that had happened? I lay in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, replaying our conversation over and over in my mind. His words echoed in my head, each one cutting deeper than the last. It was a mistake. It got out of control. I never meant to hurt you, but he had hurt me, and nothing he said could change that. Finally, after days of silence, I forced myself out of bed. I couldn't stay here forever, drowning in my own misery. I had to figure out what came next. What was I supposed to do now? The house felt emptier than ever, and though Jake hadn't taken anything with him when he left, it seemed like everything had already been stripped away. I wandered through the rooms, touching objects that used to hold meaning. Our wedding photos, the throw blanket we bought on our honeymoon, the coffee mug Jake had given me for our first anniversary. Each item felt like a ghost of the life I thought I knew, a life that no longer existed. I couldn't stay in this space, surrounded by these memories. I needed air. I needed to get out. I grabbed my coat and keys and walked out the door, not even sure where I was going. I found myself driving aimlessly through town, past familiar streets and landmarks that now seemed foreign to me. The people outside, bustling about their lives, seemed so distant, as if I were watching them through a thick, invisible wall. How were they all so normal when my world had been destroyed? My car eventually wound up at the park Jake and I used to visit when we first started dating. It was autumn, and the trees were a riot of oranges, reds, and yellows, but the beauty of it was lost on me. I sat on a bench, watching the leaves drift slowly to the ground, feeling just as untethered and aimless as they were. I pulled out my phone, staring at Chloe's messages that I'd left unanswered. I knew she was worried about me, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. She had been the one to tell me, to rip the blindfold off and show me the truth. I knew she was only looking out for me, but there was a part of me that almost resented her for it. If she hadn't sent that photo, would I have kept living in ignorant bliss? Would I have kept believing that Jake and I were fine? I knew I couldn't avoid her forever. With a deep breath, I finally opened her latest message. I'm here for you. Whenever you're ready to talk, call me. I'll drop everything. Her words made me choke up. She had always been there for me, through every bad breakup, every bad day. I wasn't alone, no matter how much it felt that way right now. But instead of calling her, I found myself scrolling to Jake's name. My heart pounded in my chest as my finger hovered over his contact. I hadn't spoken to him since that day in the kitchen. I had asked him to leave, but now that he was gone, the silence between us felt unbearable. I didn't know what I was expecting. Maybe I wanted closure, or maybe I wanted to hurt him the way he had hurt me. Before I could talk myself out of it, I hit call. It rang once.
Twice.
Then, Jake's voice came through the phone. Hello. I froze, unsure of what to say now that I had him on the line. The sound of his voice was both familiar and alien, comforting and painful all at once. I could hear the uncertainty in his tone, as if he didn't know whether to expect an apology or another explosion of anger. Hi, I said, my voice small and fragile, like it might break if I spoke any louder. He let out a breath, as if he'd been holding it. How are you?
How was I?
That was the question, wasn't it? But the answer wasn't something I could sum up in a few words. I wasn't okay, but I wasn't falling apart either. I was somewhere in between, adrift in a sea of uncertainty. I don't know, I admitted.
I.
I don't know how I'm supposed to feel. I don't know what to do. He was silent for a moment. I've been giving you space, like you asked. I didn't want to push. I know, I said quietly. But we can't just leave it like this, Jake. We need to talk. We need to figure out what happens next. The line was quiet again, and I wondered if he was going to say something that would make this all make sense, if that was even possible. But he didn't. When he spoke again, his voice was soft, almost broken. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if I can. There it was, the truth I had been dreading. Even he didn't know if this could be repaired. The weight of that realization settled on my chest like a heavy stone. Could we fix this? Did I even want to try? What do you want, Jake? I asked, my voice trembling. Do you want to fix this? Do you want to try? I want you, he said quickly, his voice filled with desperation. I want us. But I don't know how to make up for what I did. I don't know if you'll ever be able to trust me again. I didn't know either. Trust was the foundation of our relationship, and it had crumbled the moment I saw that photo. Could I ever look at him again without wondering where he'd been, what he'd been doing, and who he was with? Could I ever believe his words without questioning whether they were lies? But as much as I was hurting, as much as I wanted to scream at him for what he had done, there was still a part of me, a small, quiet part, that didn't want to give up on us. 7 years of marriage, a decade of being together. Was I really ready to throw that all away? I don't know if I can trust you again, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But I don't know if I'm ready to let go either. Jake's breath hitched on the other end of the line. I'm so sorry, Claire. I know I've ruined everything, but I'll do anything to make it right. If you'll just give me a chance. A part of me wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that he could change, that he could be the man I thought I had married. But there was another part of me, the part that had been crushed by his betrayal, that couldn't help but wonder. Was love enough? Could love really repair the damage he had done? I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice cracking. I don't know how to move forward from this. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken words, unshed tears. When Jake finally broke the silence, his voice was soft but firm. Take your time, he said. I'll wait. However long it takes, I'll wait for you. I nodded. Even though he couldn't see me, I needed time. Time to figure out what I wanted, time to decide if this was something we could salvage or if it was already too broken to fix. When we hung up, I felt both a sense of relief and a fresh wave of uncertainty. Nothing had been resolved, but at least now, we had started a conversation. Maybe that was the first step. In the weeks that followed, I focused on myself for the first time in what felt like forever. I still couldn't bring myself to talk to Jake face to face, and though he texted me a few times to check in, I kept my responses brief. I needed space. Space to think, to breathe, to figure out who I was without him. I started going to the gym again, something I hadn't done in years. I threw myself into work, staying late at the office to avoid coming home to the emptiness that awaited me. I met Chloe for coffee, finally opening up to her about everything that had happened. She listened, offering comfort without judgment, and for the first time since my world had shattered, I felt a glimmer of hope. Do you think people can change? I asked her one day, as we sat in our favorite coffee shop, the autumn sun filtering through the windows. Chloe took a sip of her latte, considering my question. I think people can change if they really want to,
But it's not easy.
and it takes a lot of time. I nodded, staring into my own cup. Jake says he wants to fix things. He says he'll do anything to make it right. But I don't know if I can trust him again. You don't have to decide right now, Chloe said gently. You're allowed to take your time. And if you decide you can't move past this, that's okay too. You don't owe him anything. Her words were like a lifeline. I didn't have to rush into a decision. I didn't have to figure it all out at once. For now, it was enough to focus on myself, to rebuild the pieces of my life that had been shattered. One afternoon, I found myself going through old photos, sifting through the memories of a life that felt so distant now. There were pictures of our wedding day, of trips we'd taken, of birthdays and holidays and quiet moments at home. I couldn't help but smile at the memories, but there was also an ache in my chest, a sadness for the life I had thought we were building together. Had it all been a lie? Had Jake been unhappy for longer than I realized? Or had something changed along the way, something I hadn't noticed until it was too late? I didn't have the answers, and maybe I never would. But as I looked at the photos, I realized something important. I wasn't defined by my relationship with Jake. Yes, he had been a huge part of my life, but I was still me. I was still Claire. And I still had a future, whether it included him or not. I closed the photo album and took a deep breath. It was time to start making decisions. Decisions for myself, not for Jake, not for the past, but for the future I wanted to create. It took me another week to reach out to Jake. I asked him to meet me at a small cafe near our house. It was a place we used to go to on lazy Sunday mornings, back when things were simpler, before everything had fallen apart. When I walked in, he was already sitting at a corner table, looking anxious. His eyes flicked to the door every few seconds until they landed on me. He stood up as I approached, his face a mixture of hope and fear. "Hey," he said softly, pulling out a chair for me. "Hi," I responded, sitting down across from him. I took a moment to gather my thoughts before speaking. I had rehearsed what I wanted to say 1,000 times in my head, but now that I was here, the words felt heavy, difficult. Jake waited, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his coffee cup. I could see the nervous energy radiating off him, and part of me hated that he still had the power to make me feel for him, even after everything. "I've been thinking a lot," I began, keeping my eyes on the table. "About us. About what happened." He nodded, not interrupting, letting me speak. "I can't pretend like this didn't happen, Jake. I can't just go back to the way things were before, as if nothing's changed." "I know," he said quietly. "I don't expect you to. I still don't know if I can trust you again." I continued, my voice steady. "But I also don't know if I'm ready to give up on us. I need time. And if we're going to try to fix this, it's going to take a lot of work. I need to know that you're committed to that." Jake looked up at me then, his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in a long time, vulnerability. "I'm committed," he said, his voice firm. "I'll do whatever it takes, Claire. I swear. Therapy, counseling, whatever you need. I'll be there." I nodded, feeling a flicker of hope, but also a deep sense of caution. Trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight, and the road ahead of us would be long and painful. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. "I'm not promising anything," I said slowly, meeting his gaze. "But I'm willing to try." Jake exhaled, relief flooding his features. He reached across the table, his hand hovering near mine, but not quite touching, waiting for my permission. After a moment, I placed my hand in his. His grip was gentle, tentative, as if he were afraid I might pull away. Maybe we could rebuild this. Maybe we couldn't. Only time would tell. But for now, it was enough to take that first step. Together. The days that followed were a strange mixture of hope and fear, of trying to reclaim the life we'd lost while also acknowledging the damage that had been done. It wasn't easy. Nothing about this was easy. But we took small steps, one day at a time. Jake and I agreed to see a marriage counselor, something neither of us had ever considered before. I wasn't sure if it would help, but it felt like a necessary step if we were going to have any chance of rebuilding our relationship. Trust couldn't just be repaired with promises. We needed to understand what had happened, why it had happened, and how we could prevent it from happening again. Our first session was tense. We sat in the therapist's office, surrounded by soft lighting and neutral-tone furniture that was meant to feel comforting, but the awkwardness in the air made everything feel cold. Jake sat next to me, close enough that our knees almost touched, but not quite. There was a physical gap between us that reflected the emotional chasm we were trying to bridge. The therapist, a calm woman named Dr. Lawson, introduced herself and asked us to explain why we were there. I waited for Jake to speak first, unsure if I could find the words to describe the pain and betrayal I was still carrying. "I messed up," Jake said quietly, staring at his hands. I betrayed Claire. I had an affair, and I hurt her. I hurt us." The rawness in his voice surprised me. I had expected him to be defensive or to try to explain away what he had done, but instead, he was fully admitting his wrongdoing. I wasn't sure if that made it better or worse. Hearing him say the words out loud felt like reopening a wound that had barely begun to scab over. Dr. Lawson nodded, her expression neutral. Thank you for being honest, Jake. And Claire, how are you feeling about what's happened? I hesitated, my throat tightening as I tried to speak. I don't know, I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm angry. I'm hurt. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive him, or if I can ever trust him again. The therapist gave me a sympathetic look. Those feelings are completely valid. Infidelity is one of the most painful betrayals in a relationship, and it takes time to heal from that kind of hurt. But it's good that you're both here and willing to work through it. Jake glanced at me, his face full of guilt and regret. I could see how much he was hurting too, but I wasn't ready to comfort him. Not yet. I wasn't sure if I ever would be. Dr. Lawson encouraged us to talk about the affair, about what had led up to it, but I struggled to listen. Jake spoke in halting sentences, explaining how he had felt distant, how he had been overwhelmed by work and our growing disconnection. But every word he said just felt like an excuse, and it was hard not to react with anger. So it was my fault. I snapped, my voice sharp. You cheated on me because we weren't close enough? Because you felt disconnected? Jake shook his head quickly. No, Claire, that's not what I'm saying. It wasn't your fault. It was my fault. I should have talked to you about how I was feeling instead of doing what I did. I should have been honest with you. But you weren't, I said, my voice trembling. You didn't talk to me. You didn't give me a chance to fix things. I broke off, feeling the tears welling up in my eyes. You just went to her instead. Jake's face crumpled with guilt, and he reached out, as if to take my hand, but I pulled away. I couldn't handle his touch, not right now. Dr. Lawson intervened gently. It's important to acknowledge that while there may have been issues in the relationship, the choice to have an affair is always the responsibility of the person who does it. Jake, you need to take full responsibility for your actions without placing any of the blame on Claire. Jake nodded, his voice thick with emotion. I do. I'm so sorry, Claire. I wish I could take it all back, but I can't. All I can do is try to make things right moving forward. I didn't respond. I wasn't sure if there was a way to make things right, but I stayed. I listened. I was here, and maybe that was enough for now. Over the next few weeks, Jake and I continued going to therapy, slowly unpacking the layers of hurt and confusion that had built up between us. It was hard, harder than I ever imagined it would be. There were days when I felt like we were making progress, like maybe there was hope for us after all. And then there were days when the anger and betrayal would come roaring back, threatening to tear us apart all over again. I would wake up some mornings and look at him lying next to me, and for a brief moment, everything felt normal. But then the memories would flood in, images of that other woman, of him smiling at her, touching her the way he used to touch me, and the rage would bubble up, making me want to scream. Jake was trying. I could see it in the way he looked at me, in the way he listened during our therapy sessions, in the little things he did around the house to show me he cared. He brought me coffee in bed, cooked dinner when I was too tired, left notes for me on the kitchen counter telling me he loved me. But none of it erased the past. None of it made the betrayal go away. One night, after a particularly tense therapy session where we had discussed the details of the affair in more depth than I was ready for, I snapped. We were sitting in the living room, the TV on, but neither of us really watching. The silence between us was thick, heavy with unspoken words. I couldn't take it anymore. How could you do it? I blurted out, my voice sharp. How could you just be with her, knowing what it would do to me, knowing how much it would hurt? Jake turned to look at me, his eyes filled with regret. Claire, No, I interrupted, standing up and pacing across the room. I need to know. I need to understand. Was it worth it? Was she worth destroying our marriage? Was she worth all of this? He ran a hand through his hair, his expression pained. It wasn't about her, Claire. It was never about her. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't myself. I laughed bitterly. You weren't yourself? You were yourself enough to sneak around for 6 months. You were yourself enough to lie to me every single day. He stood up, moving toward me, but I stepped back, keeping distance between us. Please, he said quietly. Please don't push me away. I'm trying, Claire. I'm trying to fix this. I shook my head, the anger and hurt swirling inside me, making it hard to breathe. I don't know if you can. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. The weight of my words seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He sagged, his shoulders slumping, and for a moment, he just stood there, silent and defeated. I love you, he said softly, his voice breaking. I love you more than anything, Claire. And I know I've ruined everything, but I'm begging you, don't give up on us. Please. I stood there, staring at him, my heart torn in two. Part of me wanted to walk away, to end this pain once and for all. But another part of me, the part that still remembered the love we once had, the part that still wanted to believe we could rebuild, couldn't do it. Not yet. I turned away, my voice quiet. I need time, Jake. I need time to figure out if I can do this. He didn't argue. He didn't push. He simply nodded, and I could see the pain in his eyes, the fear that this might be the end. But he respected my need for space, and for that, I was grateful. That night, I slept in the guest room. I couldn't bear to be next to him, not while the wounds were still so fresh. But as I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, I realized something. I wasn't ready to give up.
Not yet.
In the weeks that followed, things slowly began to change. Jake and I were still going to therapy, but the conversations weren't as raw as they had been in the beginning. We had started to focus less on the affair itself and more on the underlying issues in our marriage, the things we had both neglected over the years. It wasn't just about Jake's betrayal anymore. It was about the distance that had grown between us, the communication that had broken down, the ways we had stopped prioritizing each other. In therapy, we talked about the early days of our relationship, about what had brought us together in the first place, and I found myself remembering the love that had once been so strong, so certain. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, something shifted between us. We weren't talking about the affair, for once. We were just sitting, enjoying each other's company, the quiet hum of the TV in the background. Jake reached out, his hand resting lightly on mine. It was such a simple gesture, but it felt monumental. I looked at him, and for the first time in months, I didn't see the man who had betrayed me. I saw the man I had fallen in love with, the man who had made me laugh, who had held me when I was scared, who had promised to love me forever. I miss this, he said softly, his thumb brushing against my knuckles. I miss us. I swallowed hard, my throat tight with emotion. I miss us too. For the first time in what felt like forever, we didn't feel like two people standing on opposite sides of a chasm. We were starting to rebuild the bridge, brick by fragile brick. It was slow, and it was painful, but it was progress. That night, for the first time in months, I let him hold me as we fell asleep. His arms wrapped around me felt both foreign and familiar, and though there was still a part of me that was guarded, I allowed myself to lean into the comfort of his embrace. Rebuilding our marriage wasn't a straight path. There were setbacks, moments when I would feel the old anger and hurt rising up again, moments when I doubted whether we could ever fully heal. But there were also moments of hope, moments when I could see a future for us that didn't feel so clouded by pain. We continued therapy, and Jake kept working to prove to me that he was committed to making things right. He was patient, never pushing me to forgive him too quickly, never expecting that things would go back to normal overnight. And slowly, over time, I started to trust him again. It wasn't the same kind of trust we had before. That trust had been shattered, and in its place was something more cautious, more fragile. But it was trust nonetheless, and it was a start. We began to laugh together again, to find joy in the little things, cooking dinner together, watching a movie, going for walks in the park. These moments felt like small victories, like tiny pieces of our old life being stitched back together. But I also knew that things would never be exactly as they had been before. The scars of Jake's betrayal would always be there, a reminder of what we had gone through. But I was learning to live with those scars, to accept them as part of our story. One night, as we sat on the couch together, Jake turned to me, his expression serious. "Claire," he said quietly, "I know we've come a long way, but I also know that I don't deserve your forgiveness. I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you, if that's what it takes." I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't feel anger or resentment. I just felt peace. "I don't know if I've fully forgiven you yet," I admitted, "but I'm getting there, and I think that's enough for now." He smiled, his eyes softening with relief. "That's more than enough." We sat there in the quiet, our hands intertwined, and I realized something important. Healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about moving forward, about choosing to rebuild even when it was hard, even when it was painful. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we had a future, one that was different from what we had imagined, but one that was still worth fighting for. Days turned into weeks, and then weeks into months. Our lives began to take on a new rhythm, one that felt tentative but steady. There was still so much unspoken between us, so many raw emotions lurking just beneath the surface, but we were moving forward.
Slowly.
Jake and I had good days, and we had bad days. On the good days, it felt like we were finally finding our way back to each other. We would really talk in a way we hadn't in years. We shared stories about our day, joked about things that happened at work, made plans for the future, even if those plans were still small, uncertain steps. It felt almost normal, like we were rebuilding the life we'd lost. But the bad days were hard. There were moments when a simple comment, a glance, or a misplaced word would set off a wave of doubt, and I'd find myself spiraling back into the hurt. I would think about her again. The woman who had stolen my husband's attention for half a year. The woman who, in my darkest moments, I had hated with a passion that scared me. I hadn't asked Jake about her since that first conversation, and he hadn't offered any more information. It wasn't like I wanted to know every detail, but the questions were always there, lingering at the back of my mind. I wondered what she had that I didn't, why she had been able to pull him away from me. I wondered if he still thought about her, if part of him still missed her. These thoughts were poison, eating away at me, but I couldn't stop them. One particularly bad day, the weight of it all came crashing down on me. Jake had gone out to run errands, and I was home alone, cleaning the house, trying to keep myself busy. I was dusting the bookshelf when I knocked over one of the framed photos. Our wedding picture. It was an old photo, taken on that perfect summer day when we had promised each other forever. Jake was looking at me in the picture, his eyes filled with so much love that it was almost painful to see it now. I stared at the photo, my heart clenching in my chest. The memories of that day came flooding back. The way he had held my hand so tightly during the ceremony, the way he had whispered, "I'll never let you go," as we shared our first dance. I had believed him then. I had believed that we were unbreakable.
But now?
Now, everything felt fragile, like one wrong step could send us tumbling back into the darkness we had just barely started to climb out of. I couldn't stop the tears from coming. They slipped down my cheeks silently as I held the photo in my hands, feeling the weight of all the years between that day and now. I wanted to scream, to break something, to lash out at the unfairness of it all. Why had this happened to us? Why had Jake done this? And why was I still here, trying to fix something that felt so broken? I didn't even realize how much time had passed until I heard the front door open. Jake's voice called out from the hallway, "Claire? I'm back." I quickly wiped my eyes, trying to pull myself together, but I knew he would see the pain on my face. He always did. He came into the living room, carrying a bag of groceries, and stopped when he saw me sitting on the floor with the photo in my hands. His expression softened immediately. "Claire," he said gently, setting the bag down and coming to kneel beside me. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. The tears had stopped, but the ache in my chest was still there, deep and heavy. Jake reached out, hesitating for a moment before brushing a strand of hair away from my face. "I know it's hard," he said softly. "I know it still hurts. And I know I'm the one who caused it. But please, let me in. Don't shut me out." I closed my eyes, leaning into his touch, wanting so desperately to believe that things could get better, that we could move past this. But the hurt was still there, and no matter how much I wanted to forgive him, I wasn't sure if I could. "I'm trying," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But it's so hard, Jake. It's so hard to forget. He nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. I don't expect you to forget. I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. I just want to be here for you. I want to help you heal, even if it takes years. I looked up at him, searching his face for some sign, some proof that he truly meant what he was saying. And I saw it, the sincerity, the regret, the deep, unshakable love that had always been there, even in the worst of times. I love you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I've always loved you, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to prove that to you. A lump formed in my throat, and I blinked back the fresh wave of tears that threatened to spill over. I didn't know if love was enough to fix everything. I didn't know if I would ever fully heal from the betrayal. But in that moment, sitting on the floor with Jake beside me, I realized that I wasn't ready to give up.
Not yet.
I love you too, I said quietly, my voice trembling. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm willing to keep trying. For us. Jake's eyes filled with relief, and he reached for my hand, holding it tightly in his. We sat there for a long time, just holding on to each other, the silence between us heavy with unspoken promises and fragile hope. As time passed, Jake and I started to rebuild our relationship in small, almost imperceptible ways. It wasn't the grand gestures that mattered now, it was the little things. The quiet moments in the mornings when we sipped our coffee together, the evenings spent cooking dinner side by side, the way he would reach for my hand in the middle of the night, as if to remind me that he was still there. We had started going on walks together in the evenings, something we hadn't done in years. It became our way of reconnecting, of talking about things that didn't involve the past, of dreaming about a future that still felt uncertain but possible. One night, as we walked through the park near our house, Jake turned to me, his expression thoughtful. Do you ever think about moving away? He asked, his voice quiet. I looked at him, surprised by the question. Moving? Yeah, he said, kicking at a loose pebble on the path. I've been thinking about it a lot lately. Maybe a fresh start, somewhere new. Somewhere that doesn't have all these memories. I knew what he meant. Our town was full of places that reminded me of the affair, places I couldn't avoid, no matter how hard I tried. Every corner seemed to hold a memory of Jake and her, even though I didn't know the specifics of where they had been. It didn't matter. The entire town felt tainted by the betrayal. A fresh start, I repeated, considering it. Do you think that would help? Jake shrugged, his expression uncertain. I don't know. But it couldn't hurt, right? We could go somewhere new, somewhere that's just ours. No baggage. No history. I thought about it for a long moment. The idea of leaving everything behind, the house, the familiar streets, even the memories of our life before the affair, was both terrifying and appealing. Part of me wanted to run away from it all, to start over somewhere where I wouldn't be constantly reminded of what we had lost. But another part of me wasn't sure if that was the answer. We couldn't run from the past. It would follow us no matter where we went. I don't know, I said finally. I think maybe we need to face what's happened. Leaving might feel like an escape, but it won't change anything. We still have to deal with this. Together. Jake nodded, his eyes full of understanding. You're right. I just want to do whatever it takes to make things better. For both of us. I appreciated his willingness to fight for us, but I knew that moving away wasn't the solution. The real work had to happen between us, no matter where we were. We continued our walk in silence, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence that had filled our lives in the aftermath of the affair. It was a quiet, peaceful silence, the kind that comes when two people are slowly relearning how to be with each other. Despite the progress we were making, the shadow of the affair still hung over us. It was always there, lurking in the background, even on the good days. And no matter how hard I tried to push it out of my mind, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I hadn't asked Jake about the other woman since those early conversations. I had told myself that knowing more wouldn't help, that it would only cause me more pain. But the curiosity, the need for closure, gnawed at me. I didn't even know her name. She was just this faceless, nameless figure who had torn my life apart. One night, after another long, sleepless evening, I finally broke. We were sitting on the couch, watching a movie, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept glancing at Jake, wondering if he could sense the storm building inside me. When the movie ended, I turned off the TV and turned to him, my heart pounding. "Jake," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me, his expression instantly concerned. "What's wrong?" "I need to know," I said, my hands twisting in my lap. "I need to know more about her." Jake stiffened, his body tensing at the mention of her. He didn't speak right away, and I could see the hesitation in his eyes. But he didn't try to avoid the question. He didn't lie. "What do you want to know?" he asked quietly. I swallowed hard, unsure of where to start.
Who is she?
"What was she to you?" He let out a long, slow breath, rubbing his hands over his face. "Her name is Emily," he said, his voice strained. "We met through work. She's not from here. She was only in town for a project. It just happened." I winced at the words, even though I had expected them. Just happened felt like such a hollow explanation for something that had torn my life apart. "Did you love her?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, and as soon as I said it, I wished I could take it back. I didn't want to know the answer, but I needed to. Jake's face crumpled, and he shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "No, Claire. I didn't love her. It wasn't like that. I was stupid. I was selfish. But I never loved her. It was an escape. That's all." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. It didn't make the pain disappear, but it eased something deep inside me, knowing that I hadn't been replaced in his heart. "Why didn't you end it sooner?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why did it go on for so long?" Jake looked down at his hands, his face filled with regret. "I don't know," he admitted. "I wasn't thinking clearly. I felt like I had already screwed up, and I didn't know how to stop. I was scared, Claire. I was scared of losing you, and somehow, that fear kept me from doing the right thing. I know that doesn't make sense, but I was messed up." I didn't respond right away. His explanation didn't erase the hurt, but at least he wasn't hiding from the truth anymore. He was facing it just like I was. "I don't want to know more," I finally said, my voice firm. "I don't need to hear the details. I just needed to understand." Jake nodded, his eyes full of remorse. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry, Claire." For the first time, I believed him. In the months that followed, things between Jake and me continued to slowly improve. We still went to therapy, working through the lingering issues that had caused so much damage to our relationship. But the anger that had once dominated my thoughts was beginning to fade, replaced by something softer, something that felt like healing. It wasn't that I had forgotten about the affair. I knew I never would. But I was learning how to live with it, how to accept that it was part of our story, without letting it define us. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, Jake turned to me with a serious expression. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice quiet. "About what?" I asked, curious. "About us," he replied, his eyes softening. "I know we've been through hell this past year, but I want to start thinking about the future again. Our future." I looked at him, my heart skipping a beat. The future. For so long, I hadn't allowed myself to think about it. It had felt too uncertain, too fragile. But now, as I looked at Jake, I realized that I was ready. I was ready to start building something new. "What do you mean?" I asked softly. Jake smiled, reaching for my hand. "I mean, maybe it's time to start dreaming again. About what we want, about where we want to go. Together." Together. That word felt heavy with meaning, but for the first time in a long time it didn't scare me. It felt right. We had been through so much, more than I ever thought we could survive. But we had made it to the other side, scarred but still standing, still together. And maybe that was enough. A year after the affair, Jake and I stood at the edge of a new chapter. We had moved out of the house where so much pain had occurred, choosing to start fresh in a small, cozy home in a different neighborhood. It wasn't far from where we had lived before, but it felt different.
New.
Untouched by the past. On our first night in the new house, we stood in the living room, boxes still piled around us, and Jake pulled me into his arms. We hadn't danced in years, but there, in the soft glow of the setting sun, He swayed with me, holding me close. There was no music, no grand gestures, just the two of us, together in the quiet. "I love you," he whispered, his breath warm against my ear. "I love you too," I replied, and this time, the words felt lighter, freer. They weren't weighed down by doubt or fear. They were just true. We had made it through the darkest days, and now, we were stepping into the light. It wasn't a perfect ending. There were still moments when the past would creep in, when the hurt would resurface, but we had learned how to face it together. We had learned how to heal, how to forgive, how to love each other even when it was hard. Our story wasn't the one we had imagined when we first got married. It wasn't the fairy tale I had dreamed of, but it was real. It was messy and complicated and full of mistakes, but it was ours. And that, I realized, was enough.